Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the book log, where I log the books that I'm reading. Except for today, where I'm actually not doing that. Instead, I am going to be ranking every short story in the short story collection Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. I'm going to be ranking them from my least favorite to my most favorite, and I think this video will be quite long, so sorry about that. Just a couple of quick things to get out of the way first. I'm not going to be ranking the poems. There's two poems in this book. One is called Paranoid a Chant, and the other one is called For Owen. Didn't really feel normal to rank those among the rest of these stories, but I liked them. I thought they were pretty good. I think I liked Paranoid a Chant a little bit more. Definitely kind of gets you inside the mind of a man who is very paranoid. Pretty interesting to read Stephen King write poems. I thought For Owen was pretty good too, kind of like a cute little poem about his son, presumably. But other than that, I don't have a lot to say about those poems, so those are not included in the ranking. And the other thing that I wanted to, mention is that there are a couple of novellas in here, and I would say novellas are also, pretty different from short stories, especially some of the short stories in here, which are incredibly short. So, I just wanted to at least acknowledge that it's kind of weird to intermingle them in that way, but I'm going to do it anyway. Also, I should probably count how many stories are in here. Is it like 20? Okay, it is 20. So we'll just cut right to the chase. Starting at number 20, this is my least favorite story in Skeleton Crew, and that is Cain Rose Up. It's kind of hard to have particularly strong feelings about the story one way or another because it's so short. I think it's about 6 pages in the copy that I read. This guy right here. But even with that, I very much struggled to understand the point of this story. It's about this kid named Kurt Garish who, on the last day of classes at his university, pulls out a rifle and starts to shoot people on campus through his dorm room window, basically. And that's it. That's pretty much all that happens. He has a couple brief conversations with some people in his building, like enough to sort of give the impression that he's kind of a quiet and withdrawn type of guy, but there's not much more to glean besides that. I mean, obviously there's the loose reference to the biblical story, where Cain kills his brother Abel because he resents God or whatever. It's been a while since I was at church to know what actually happens in that story. But it's hard to connect that to the motivations of Kurt Garish in the story because we really just don't know what his deal is. Why is he mad? What sort of injustice or pressure is he experiencing? We just don't know. So it's basically this asshole who kills some people for no reason. It feels like King expounded on his idea here in Rage, which is the worst book he ever wrote. So maybe the brevity of the story works in his favor. Hard to say. Just not a very big fan of that one. Okay, number 19. Coming in at number 19, we have the story The Wedding Gig. If I had to describe the story in 2 words, I would probably say uncomfortable and also unnecessary. That sounds kind of harsh, and I guess it is, and this is my second to last my second to least favorite story on this list. But that's not to say that I think this story has absolutely zero redeeming qualities. It's just that the redeeming qualities it does have happen to be buried in some material that just kind of comes across obnoxious and mean-spirited. I'll try to explain the sort of convoluted plot. So the story is told from the perspective of this unnamed jazz band leader who is hired by a guy named Mike Scoley, who's sort of like a Prohibition era mobster type of guy. And he's hired to play at Mike Scoley's sister Maureen's wedding. The entire conceit of the story is more or less that Mike Scoley's sister is extremely overweight and her husband is extremely thin and small. And isn't that a funny visual? So at this wedding gig, one of Scoley's mob rivals just blackmails this random man to come into the wedding and hurls some really nasty insults at Maureen, which subsequently leads to this massive shootout resulting in Mike's death. And I guess a couple years down the line, Maureen and this jazz band guy meet up at some show, and she kind of confides in him that she's really guilty and she has a lot of self-loathing over her brother's death. And then so after that, she goes on to become an even more successful mobster until she dies of a heart attack some years later. I don't know. I just thought the story was kind of directionless, and the way that King describes Maureen throughout the story is honestly pretty like gross and demeaning, and it's really not sympathetic in any way whatsoever. He tries to cushion this by making the protagonist like feel sorry for her and for her plight, and to make him reflect on the judgmental way that he was treating her and his judgmental perceptions of her. But even then, it just kind of comes across like, oh man, she must have a really hard life because of how disgusting and unlovable she is. I don't think Stephen King hates overweight people or anything, and I think that this story is actually trying to show compassion to them in some weird roundabout way, but if that's what he's trying to do, I would say that it sort of fails. I did enjoy the Prohibition era setting. King just does a really good job of writing in that voice, and I know he's written in this era for other stories as well. But beyond that, I just didn't care about this one, especially since all the interesting stuff, like, you know, the mob violence and whatnot, is just secondary to the gawking, I guess. So, yeah, I don't know. Not completely awful, but just kind of vaguely annoying and pointless. So at number 18, we have Big Wheels, A Tale of the Laundry Game, parentheses, Milkman number 2. It's kind of difficult to talk about this story without mentioning Milkman number 1 because they're sort of related, even though in this collection they're separate stories. And apparently both of the stories are excerpts from an unreleased novel called The Milkman, which Stephen King eventually just shelved. Neither of the two Milkman stories really reads like a short story with a self-contained plot, but Milkman number 1, which I'll talk about later, definitely gets away with it more successfully by being so short and concise. In Milkman number 2, the excerpt quality is felt a lot more, and the inherent lack of context that would have been given through the rest of the unreleased novel is just a lot harder to ignore. Really, all that happens in the story is these two laundry press workers, Rocky and Leo, like drunk driving through some small towns in the Pittsburgh area. There's some type of inspection certification thing on Rocky's car that's about to expire at midnight, so they stop at a garage run by this guy named Bob, who Rocky knows from his past, I guess. They kind of shoot the shit for a while. Bob certifies the car, then Rocky and Leo proceed to drive off into the night. Leo makes some ominous remark about how they're being followed by the Milkman. Rocky freaks out. They both proceed to die in a car crash. Oh, and also Bob randomly kills his wife and burns down his house for some reason. Again, it just feels kind of weird and out of place, and there are too many pieces of missing context, too many unanswered questions for this to work as a standalone story. For example, Leo keeps saying something about how there's a hole in his back from working at the laundry, and every time he brings it up, Rocky gets super like weird and suspicious and tells him to stop talking about it, something which never gets even a hint of an explanation. Also, Bob killing his wife is totally out of left field, not really explained apart from implying that he had an unhappy marriage. And then there's the Milkman himself. It's brought up at one point that Spike, the Milkman, had an affair with Rocky's wife and got her pregnant, but nothing that really justifies Rocky's utter terror and panic at just the sheer mention of him, leading him to drive head-on into traffic. Also, despite all of this lack of information and confusion and lack of context, I still don't even really feel the desire to read the full version of this novel. Like, I can understand King's decision to can it in the first place, just from reading this one chapter. I don't know, I feel like I'm kind of rambling on this one. This story is just hard to make sense of for me. Probably because it's not really a story. Like, would you just pick up some random novel, flip to the middle, and read, like, chapter 32 by itself? Probably not. And that's more or less what this is. Okay, so coming in at number 17 is the story Here There Be Tygers. This is a weird little story. Emphasis on little. There is really not a lot to talk about here. Another very short story, probably like 5 pages or something like that. You have this 3rd grade kid named Charles who asks to use the bathroom, which he keeps calling the basement for some reason. He gets embarrassed by the teacher in front of the whole class, and then when he gets to the bathroom, there's just kind of a tiger chilling in there around the corner. Both his classmate Kenny and his teacher, Miss Bird, go into the bathroom to check on him, and both times Charles exits the bathroom before he can see what, if anything, happens to them in there. When he first re-enters the bathroom after Kenny, he smells copper, so like maybe blood. But besides that, there's no real evidence or verification that the tiger is actually real at all. It's an interesting little concept, but again, it's such a short story that it's kind of hard to analyze it in any meaningful way. Maybe it's a metaphor for anxiety or something. Not sure. It's got a weird kind of dreamlike ambiance that I enjoy, but outside of that, there's not really a whole lot to say about this one. Okay, number 16, we have the monkey. Have you ever seen one of those cymbal-banging monkey toys and thought, hey, that thing looks kind of creepy? Well, apparently so is Stephen King, and that's pretty much the inspiration to this entire story, so far as I can tell. Basically, this guy named Hal found one of these things deep in his father's closet one day as a kid, and throughout his childhood, every time the monkey clapped its cymbals together, someone close to Hal died. He basically spent his entire youth getting, tormented by this thing, and no matter how many times he tried to dispose of it, it would always find its way back and continue killing. It killed Hal's close childhood friend, it killed his babysitter, his uncle's dog, it even ends up killing Hal's own mother. Also, the monkey doesn't personally kill these people, they die in all sorts of different ways, but it always happens shortly after Hal hears the cymbals crashing together. The story is told with two parallel timelines, one being in the present with Hal as an adult, kind of once more finding the monkey, and the other being basically a series of flashbacks to Hal as a child and all of the original trauma from when he was first dealing with the monkey. The whole concept of a childhood terror that you have to reckon with again in adulthood feels kind of like a prototype to It in some ways. There are some pretty scary elements to the story. King describes the monkey itself in a pretty unsettling way with its weird eyes and grinning teeth and gross, matted fur. The way the monkey continuously reappears in Hal's house, no matter how hard he tries to get rid of it, is pretty effectively creepy, I would say, and I think he does a good job of describing the dread of hearing the monkey's little tinny cymbals crashing together, knowing that it's going to cause somebody's gruesome death. My primary issue with this story, and the reason that it's kind of low on this ranking, is that it's just way too long and repetitive. Easily could have been cut in half, honestly. Each of the deaths Hal experiences in his childhood unfold in basically the exact same way. There's a ton of unnecessary exposition into Hal's family and his relationship with his sons and his brother and his aunt and his uncle and his wife, and I just thought a lot of it was a drag. Obviously, King likes to, build in-depth characters, which is fine, but in this story, I just didn't feel like it was adding anything, and it was largely irrelevant to the creepy monkey plot. Also, at the end of this story, Hal and his son decide to put the monkey in a duffel bag filled with rocks and dump it into a lake to defeat it. Very Duma Key, by the way. But I don't get why. The monkey has shown time and time again that it can literally teleport, so why would this time be any different? It's implied at the end that the monkey is still alive down there at the bottom of the lake, but I guess I just don't understand the plan in the first place, or how Hal decided that that was the appropriate solution. I don't know. It's a pretty good haunted artifact story, and despite how bloated it is, it got a good deal of creepiness across. Those monkey toy things are unsettling, and they probably are actually evil. All right, so number 15, we have Morning Deliveries, Milkman number 1. So again, I just talked about this a couple minutes ago. Both this story and Milkman number 2 are excerpts from an unreleased novel called The Milkman. And again, they definitely both feel like excerpts as opposed to self-contained stories. You can once again sense that missing information. You can sense the missing context to the events that are occurring. But I think that this concept works a little bit better with this story here than the second one. For one, the story is extremely short, one of the shortest in the entire collection, and I would say that its brevity kind of works to keep the story concise, just let the strangeness speak for itself a little bit. So it's following around the Milkman, Spike Milligan. The Milkman's name is Spike Milligan. And it's following him around as he's doing his morning delivery route. He's giving the residents of this neighborhood the various dairy products that they have ordered. King painstakingly describes this crisp, beautiful suburban morning. He's describing the sunrise and the squirrels and the tree branches swaying in the wind. He creates a really vivid and kind of picturesque atmosphere of the neighborhood the milkman is driving through. But then it's all contradicted as it's revealed that the milkman is leaving surprises, as he calls them, in some of the delivery orders, including deadly poisons and large spiders. It's a very unsettling concept, and the way that it's juxtaposed against this beautiful, serene suburban imagery is really sharp and interesting, I thought. Unlike the other Milkman story, this one more or less works as a standalone piece, I guess, and even though there's not much to it, it does have a certain salient quality to it that I enjoyed. All right, up next at number 14, we have The Reaper's Image. Of all the really short stories in this collection, I think this one's probably my favorite. Also, I believe this is one of the first stories Stephen King ever published. I think he was 19 years old or something like that. So you got this guy, Mr. Spangler, and he's getting toured around this kind of derelict old museum by Mr. Carlin. But the only artifact he's truly interested in seeing is the Delver glass mirror. He just thinks it's this flawless, beautifully crafted piece of work, and he does not believe the rumors that whoever looks into the mirror sees the Reaper, then disappears. Mr. Carlin, however, the curator of the museum, is terrified of the object. Once he was giving a tour of the museum, and this high school student notices a little blemish in the upper corner of the mirror. And at first he just thought it was something wrong with the glass, but then after that he reports seeing the Grim Reaper standing behind him. He quickly runs out of the museum, never seen again. Mr. Spangler, who is still unconvinced by these tales, decides to look into the mirror anyway, and he notices that the reflection has this sort of unusual magnified quality that makes the background reflection look sort of surreal and strange. Then he notices what he thinks is tape, once again in the upper left-hand corner of the mirror. Just like the high school student from before, he gets suddenly really sick, runs away, and once again is just never seen again. The story ends with Carlin just waiting for him to come back. I think the story is super unsettling. It does a really good job of conveying a lot of creepiness in such a small amount of pages, but it's still a little bit too small to take much more away from it, I would say. I do appreciate how nothing scary is ever really shown in the reflection, only implied. There's something wrong with the mirror and there are rumors, but we never know exactly what is going on because it doesn't hurt anyone. It just makes you disappear, which I think is super cool, super creepy. It's creepy on the periphery, and sometimes that's the best kind of creepy, I think. So next at number 13, we have the story Nona. Nona is kind of a difficult story to decipher, and I think that both helps and hurts my enjoyment of it to some degree. It's kind of strange and dreary, and it's full of ambiguity, both in the events that take place and just in the general unreliability of the narrator, and it's hard to get a grasp on exactly what happens and why. It's narrated by this recent college dropout guy who's never named throughout the story, and he's hitchhiking through Maine, and he falls in love with this weird girl named Nona who he meets at a diner. The way the story is structured is it kind of switches back and forth between the narrator discussing his life story, how he was an orphan, the various women he's loved, and the trouble he's gotten into, leading him to wander through Maine in the first place. And then there's this other present-day narrative of him and Nona kind of just traveling through Maine, running away from nothing, and just murdering a whole bunch of random strangers along the way. In the flashback sections, he has some run-ins with Ace Merrill, a notorious Stephen King villain from both Needful Things and The Body, which is a fun little crossover. He definitely had a rough childhood. His parents and his brother died in a car crash when he was young, but nothing really indicates him as a vicious killer who essentially spends the rest of the story just going on this giant murder rampage. Throughout the story, him and Nona travel together through Maine, and they end up killing two different guys who offer to hitch them a ride. Then they kill a police officer, and then they kill a snowplow driver just because they were in the way. It's kind of implied throughout the story that Nona has some sort of supernatural hold on the narrator, and she ends up luring him to a graveyard. And then once they're there, she transforms into this giant, disgusting rat, which, to be fair, was kind of foreshadowed throughout the story. And she leaves the narrator there to be discovered and arrested. And the reason I said the story is ambiguous is because as the narrator is writing this all down in jail, he mentions that in the testimony of all the people who saw him, they claimed he was alone. No one saw Nona with him, so it's unclear whether she just escaped unnoticed or if she was just a figment of his imagination the whole time. I do think the story is vaguely hard to follow at certain points, but a lot of that felt intentional, and I enjoyed the twist ending. The fact that the narrator has no real motive to go on this sort of rampage and is an otherwise relatively normal guy does add an interesting degree of uncertainty. If Nona was real, then what was she? If not, then what's wrong with the narrator? I think the story just makes for some enjoyable speculation, even though it kind of takes an unusual path to get there. So at number 12, we have Word Processor of the Gods. A writer is gifted a strange word processor from his recently deceased nephew, which has the ability to both add and delete things from existence. What could go wrong? Nothing, apparently. The story kind of subverted my expectations a little bit because it set up perfectly to be this sort of monkey's paw, be careful what you wish for parable. But instead of an unwieldy power creating problems within the life of our main character, everything more or less works out for him in the end. Richard Hagstrom is his name, and he's just like a depressed dude who's an unsuccessful writer. He hates his wife, Lena. He doesn't like his son, Seth. He also resents his annoying brother Roger for kind of making it out with a nice family and a nice life. In fact, Roger's wife, Belinda, actually used to date Richard in high school, and their son John is like much smarter, he's much kinder, and he gets along better with Richard than his own son. Tragically, Roger ends up killing both Belinda and John by drunkenly driving a van off a cliff, but it turns out John, Richard's nephew, had been working on this custom word processor for his uncle, like as a birthday gift before he died. And he quickly realizes that this word processor has some type of supernatural power to add and delete things from existence. One thing leads to another, and Richard decides to delete his annoying son and wife from reality. And instead bring back Belinda and John to be his real wife and son. And that's exactly what happens. It pretty much works out, and it's implied that they all live happily ever after. It's kind of a strange feeling because on one hand, technically this is a happy ending. Like, through the use of this magical word processor, Richard has effectively solved all of his life problems, but I'm still left with a little bit of a feeling of unease. Like, this man basically just unceremoniously ended the lives of his wife and child without even a hint of remorse or trepidation. Like, they definitely were not pleasant people, but they weren't evil or anything. Can it really be a happy ending with that sort of guy on the receiving end of the happiness? Were his actions justified? It's hard to say, but it's fun to think about, and it's kind of just fun to put yourself in his shoes. Like, what would you do with that kind of power? Thought it was a neat little story. All right, at number 11, we have The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands. I love the breathing method from different seasons, and I love the concept of the club that it introduces. The breathing method itself colors in the details of this place a lot more than this story does, but it's essentially this weird, enigmatic private club in downtown Manhattan that feels straight out of the Twilight Zone or something. It's got like a seemingly infinite amount of hallways and rooms, like strange, non-existent books from non-existent authors. It's got this mysterious, ageless butler named Stevens who looks suspiciously exactly like his grandfather who used to work at the club. The conceit of this place is that people come here on a regular basis to tell stories to one another, and the club itself is more or less just a framing device for Stephen King to tell a story within a story, which he is wont to do. But I've always loved this concept, and I had no idea that he ever returned to it until I read this story. I'm glad he did, though, because the setting is this kind of perfect mixture of unusual and also somehow cozy. Kind of gives you the sense of like gathering around the fire on a cold winter night to hear some bizarre tale. And in the case of The Man Who Would Not Shake Hands, the person telling the story is an older gentleman named George Gregson, who is recalling an incident in which him and some friends played a poker game with a peculiar man named Henry Brower, who refused to touch anybody. Henry wins this poker game. The game itself, by the way, is described in very acute detail. And one of the other players goes to shake Henry's hand, which leads to Henry having a nervous breakdown and running off into the night, basically. George, the narrator, kind of spends the next several days wandering around looking for him, and he learns through word of mouth that Henry spent some time in India and believed that he was cursed by accidentally causing the death of a young boy. I won't go into the details of all that, but the curse was that anyone he touched would die, basically. So that's why he refused to shake anybody's hand. That's why he refused to touch anybody. And that curse turns out to be true. Not only did the man who shook his hand at the poker game die shortly after, but Henry himself was found dead some weeks later, like one hand grasped in his other hand. Kind of a cool image to end on, I guess. Like the breathing method, it's a kind of stark and intense story, and I love how both of them have just a hint of the supernatural, but with enough sort of plausible deniability to keep you guessing. Once again, I sort of wish more time was spent in the club itself, but I don't know. I guess the kind of cagey way that it's described does contribute to its mysterious aura. I'm glad it popped up again, though. I think it's a really neat framing device, and I hope King brings it back, one or two more times. All right, top 10. We're just now entering the top half. Wow. At number 10, we have Gramma. This story is really firing on all cylinders. It's scary, it's emotional, it's weird. It's maybe a bit long-winded, but there's just a lot to like about it for a lot of different reasons. For one, the premise itself just makes for a lot of intensely creepy moments. It's about this kid named George who is tasked with watching his grandma for a few hours because his mom has to go visit his brother in the ER after breaking his leg. And not only is his grandma described as this like enormous, ancient, dour monstrosity of a woman who has scared George his whole life, but she also just happens to die on his watch. So like a lot of the story involves the mental processes of George as he has to figure out like what to do with his dead grandma just lying there. First, he does a bunch of little tests to confirm that she is dead. And when he does, he tries to call the doctor, but the phone lines are down. He seems to be a pretty anxious little boy, and he's kind of obsessing over making sure that he handles the situation correctly. And for whatever reason, he's really concerned about covering grandma's face because that's how they do it in the movies. King once again nailing a very like realistic feeling thought process of a child character. And one of the most terrifying scenes in the story, right after he covers her face, grandma like snatches his arm for a brief moment and he like shrieks and runs away. But then when he looks back into the room, her body and arm are in the exact same position, like as if nothing ever happened. So George can't really do anything with the phone lines down, so he just has to wait. And while doing so, he does a lot of reflection on some of the suspicious things he's overheard his mom talk about grandma over the years. He remembers hearing about grandma suddenly getting these strange books. He remembers hearing about how they like got kicked out of the church. He also remembers an incident where his grandma is like uttering some weird words in a foreign language and then his uncle dying shortly after, which I guess makes you wonder why his mom ever left George alone with grandma in the first place, but I digress. Basically, he comes to the conclusion that his grandma is a witch, and right as he comes to this conclusion, her corpse kind of begins to beckon to him from the other room. And then there's this pretty horrifying chase sequence as this giant monster zombie corpse woman is slowly lumbering towards George. She like traps him in a corner, and right as her hands wrap around his neck, the story cuts to an hour later. And the ending of this story is also left ambiguous because it's implied that maybe grandma has overtaken the body of George and intends to do some witchcraft through him now that her body is dead. I just really enjoyed the way the story sort of slowly reveals its hand. It's first this kind of terrifying and sad psychological experience of a little boy being alone with his grandmother's dead body, that he kind of just steadily introduces these strange mystic elements. He kind of gets into the unusual and secretive dynamic of this family, and he finally ends it with some classic monster mayhem zombie chase stuff with a cryptic ending. Again, it's possibly a little bit long-winded, and the end sequence is maybe a bit hard to follow, but it really has everything you could feasibly want crammed into a good Stephen King story, so it just made the cut into my top half of this collection. So at number 9, we have the first of the two novellas, The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet. This is a story that is directly about madness and the process of going mad and how people's delusional fantasies can play into each other in various dangerous ways. But despite all of that, the story manages to be pretty impressively subtle and like reserved. So like a lot of Stephen King stories, once again, the framing device here is a character telling a story to a group of people. And I think the like intentional alienation from the events that occurred helped to give the story kind of a more understated quality, and it also adds again like another shade of ambiguity or uncertainty into the fold because we're not getting these events told to us directly. It's a story being told secondhand about a man who is claiming to have gone mad. The narrator himself even admits that it's hard to gauge the reliability of the things he's saying, but it's a good story nevertheless, so he decides to tell it. So this narrator's name is Henry, and he used to be the fiction editor for Logan's magazine. One day he receives a short story in the mail by a man named Reg Thorpe, who is an already somewhat established novelist. And the story is called The Ballad of the Flexible Bullet. Henry reads through the story, instantly thinks it's a masterpiece, and kind of begins a regular correspondence with Reg Thorpe regarding getting the story published. And it's through these correspondences that Henry learns of Reg's madness. He has a whole host of paranoid delusions, such as the belief that tiny elves called fornits live inside his typewriter, and through the use of a dust-like substance called fornis, which they sprinkle around, they are able to bring good luck and creativity to Reg as he writes his stories. He also believes that electricity emits some type of radiation that gives people brain cancer, and he holds a more general paranoid belief that he is being constantly surveilled and followed by a mysterious they, which is just like an unnamed group or person who just kind of has it out for him in general, possibly because of his knowledge of the Fornits, although it's not really explicitly explained. At first, these things come across as kind of funny or almost whimsical in a certain way, and Henry's like plays along with his fantasies just to humor him and to get the story moving along. But as their correspondence continues, Henry begins to start genuinely believing some of these things. It doesn't help that at this point, Henry is like a barely functioning alcoholic who gets blackout drunk on a regular basis. But one way or another, Reg's fantasies begin to rub off on Henry, who begins to display his own version of these paranoid delusions. Like, he also begins to suspect that there's something dangerous about electricity, and he goes out of his way to rid his apartment of any and all appliances, lights, devices, anything that uses electricity. He like covers his outlets with aluminum foil, and he even begins to suspect that there might be some truth to the idea of Fornits, the little tiny elves. So yeah, like through their continued correspondence with each other, they further drive each other into madness, playing off each other's fantasies until it culminates with Reg going into a full paranoid fit of rage at his wife and housekeeper, who he suspects are against him, and ends up shooting himself in the head. This does snap Henry out of it, so to speak, but there is still a tinge of doubt, because not only does Henry claim to have personally seen a tiny hand reach out from beneath the keys of his typewriter, but Reg's wife also claims to have heard a tiny voice screaming during all the commotion that led to Reg's death. I guess the point of madness being a flexible bullet is to say that madness is just unpredictable. It can hit anyone at any time. Its path might not be straight, and its trajectory and its impact are never certain. And that's why the ending is ambiguous once again. And that's also kind of why I enjoy this story so much. Are we to believe that Reg's madness was so infectious that it got to both his wife as well as Henry? Or maybe Fornits are real and it's everybody else who is mad. It is impossible to truly know. So moving along here, at number 8, we have the story Uncle Otto's Truck. There are many stories in King's body of work which deal with evil machines that are endowed with life, including several about cars and trucks specifically. But I kind of like the more subtle, psychological way he does it in Uncle Otto's Truck. There is an evil semi-truck at the center of the story, but really the story is about Uncle Otto. He was this wealthy landowner who got rich on post-depression land speculation, and one day him and his business partner George crash a semi-truck onto the side of the road near Castle Rock. And for whatever reason, Otto decides to build a house right across the road from the truck, which has just lain there abandoned for many years. But one day when they're out kind of visiting the wreckage of the truck, it actually slips off of its axles and crushes George to death. Otto becomes something of a social recluse after this event, and although it's never confirmed, his nephew Quentin begins to suspect him of crushing George with the truck intentionally, maybe. And as an old man, Otto has been showing increasingly strange behavior. He's always standing in the frame of his front door, just staring at the derelict truck for hours. He keeps claiming that it's ever so slowly moving closer and closer to the house. And one day, his nephew Quentin goes to visit his uncle, only to find him lying dead in his bedroom. And when he goes to touch Otto, like motor oil begins to leak out of his eyes and his nose, and he finds an old spark plug like rammed into his mouth. And to make it even weirder, later they do an autopsy on him, and it's discovered that his body is literally just filled with oil, despite never finding any sort of jug nearby or anything. Super, super weird imagery, very strange. But like the evil itself is kind of subtly described in the story. It's kind of the opposite of how he does it in his short story Trucks, where the trucks are clearly and visibly sentient and they make their plans of destroying humanity like explicitly clear. In Uncle Otto's Truck, it's never shown doing anything. Any accidents it's involved with have plausible deniability as accidents, but at the same time the ending is so inexplicable that you have no choice but to concede that the truck is alive and evil and did in fact set out to personally kill Otto. It just stands out as such an unusual story in a genre that is intrinsically unusual, and I guess I'm just surprised that I liked it so much. Possibly my favorite evil vehicle story by Stephen King, except for maybe Christine, and I will always love that I have multiple to choose from. At number 7, we have The Reach. This is a really touching, thoughtful, and also pretty sad ending to the Skeleton Crew collection. This is the last story in the collection. Stephen King obviously has plenty of stories on the more literary side of things, but The Reach is the only one in this particular collection. As opposed to most of the other stories in this collection, which are largely about evil supernatural creatures or unexplainable events, this one is more of an understated reflection on death and aging and home and the passage of time. It's also about a very old woman named Stella who has never crossed the Reach, which is the body of water that separates her home on Goat Island from the mainland of Maine. Throughout the story, Stella spends a lot of time justifying this fact to herself. She's never left the island because everything she's ever needed is right here. All her friends, all her family, like generations of her community, her entire life has been contained right here on Goat Island. There's been no reason for her to ever have left it. It's better to plow deep than to plow wide, she says. Stella also has cancer, and so she kind of knows her time is coming soon, and this winter, she's begun to see visions of her late husband, Bill, around the town. One day, she sees Bill standing on the frozen reach, beckoning to her, so Stella dresses up in her warmest clothes and, for the first time in her life, begins the trek across the water to the mainland. And as she's crossing the reach, it begins to snow harder and harder until Stella is walking through basically whiteout conditions. And then when her hat blows off, Bill appears and gives her his hat to use. It's this really like wistful, sad, metaphorical sequence where Stella's literal trip across the frozen water is also her trip to the afterlife. As she's kind of trudging through this dense whiteness, people from her past, like people who have passed away on Goat Island, all kind of start emerging from the periphery, and they're more or less acting as guides, kind of like taking Stella with them to whatever comes next across the reach. And the very end of the story is Stella's son like finds her body the next day, and she's still wearing Bill's hat. Apparently the original name to the story was Do the Dead Sing, and I think that's a perfectly apt name for this story as well, because, you know, in the story the dead do sing. People kind of live on in memory long after they have passed away, and the after effect of their lives just casts a shadow far into the future. This is a really beautiful story, poignant end to the collection, and it kind of just, you know, fondly lingers in your head for a while. It's a good change of pace from the rest of the collection. I guess it's a little bit interesting that the only story like this happens to also be the last story, but I really loved it, honestly. I think this is a beautiful little story. All right, at number 6, we have the story Beachworld. Stephen King, to me, is kind of underrated as a science fiction writer in general. There's the Jaunt, which I'll talk about later. Spoiler. And, you know, obviously there are science fiction elements sprinkled all throughout the Dark Tower series. And I don't know, it just feels like he always kind of has some unique take on the genre. And I think that extends into this story as well. Maybe it's because he does it so infrequently, but I would say that Beachworld is another example. It's actually probably one of the strangest stories in this whole collection. It takes place thousands of years into the future, where these two space travelers named Shapiro and Rand crash their ship onto a planet made entirely of sand. There's dunes and dunes as far as the eye can see, and literally nothing else besides their crashed ship. So, like, on one hand, it's a survival story because Shapiro has to sift through the wreckage of the crashed ship. He's got to try to establish communication for rescue. He's got to salvage as much drinkable water as he can to withstand the harsh elements. But on the other hand, this beach world planet has some strange kind of hypnotic effects. Rand has seemingly become obsessed with the dunes. He's not interested in rescue. He won't drink water. He won't even move from his spot atop a dune, just peering out to the endless sand. He's kind of just hypnotized. Shapiro also is kind of hearing some weird stuff, like in his mind. He keeps thinking that the sand is speaking to him. So eventually rescue comes and they're forced to leave Rand behind because he just refuses to move. I thought the whole rescue sequence was fun because there's all sorts of weird sci-fi characters that randomly pop up. Like there's some humanoid androids called Andes. There's a man whose bottom half is just replaced by tank treads. I think there's also is a vague Dark Tower reference, as like a sharpshooter is described as being one with his gun in a very similar way to how Stephen King describes gunslingers in that series. Either way, the ship just barely escapes, and as it's doing so, this giant sand hand emerges and nearly swipes down the entire ship before it can lift off. Not sure why the sand planet would have like a conception of human hands, but the story ends in one of the weirdest scenes I've ever read in a Stephen King book, which is just Rand sitting on the same dune. He still hasn't moved, and he's just shoveling handfuls of sand into his mouth and swallowing them. I'm honestly surprised I don't hear this story mentioned more often because it has a lot of the same unusual elements that other popular Stephen King short stories have. It's pretty bizarre, but I don't know, it has a certain weird charm to it that I just loved. So coming in at number 5, we have The Jaunt. I was very excited to read this one because throughout my years of being a Stephen King fan, The Jaunt has always been hyped up as one of his all-time best, all-time most terrifying stories. I pretty much already knew the whole concept, and I more or less knew the ending, so I was definitely fighting my own expectations going into it a little bit, afraid that it might have been overdone and that it would kind of fail to live up to my pretty lofty expectations. But fortunately, this story has a pretty bulletproof premise, and despite knowing a lot about what I was getting into, it was still a fantastic and very existentially horrifying tale. Basically, it's hundreds of years into the future. Humanity has invented a teleportation technique called jaunting. The science is explained vaguely throughout the story, something about particle deconstruction and reconstruction, but the point is that people and goods can now be transported instantly across the solar system, which has revolutionized everything about human life. The story follows this man named Mark Oates and his family who are about to go on a jaunt to Mars for something to do with Mark's job. They're waiting in the jaunt station, which is more or less described as an airport terminal. Well, jaunt attendants are going group to group, preparing the passengers. His 2 kids and wife have never jaunted before, so while they're all waiting around for their turn, Mark begins to tell them the history of the jaunt. I think the story is structured in an interesting way because it kind of switches back and forth between Mark like relaying the story to his family and then the actual historical events themselves occurring. So a few hundred years prior, in the 1980s, a scientist named Victor Carroon kind of accidentally invents this teleportation technique. It's perfectly able to transport inanimate objects with no issue at all, but he notices that when he tries to send mice through the machine, they either come out dead or come out acting incredibly strange and zoned out, and then they die like shortly after. He does some trial and error, and he comes to learn that in order for living beings to go through the machine without harm, they have to be unconscious. Something about consciousness is not able to be properly deconstructed by the machine, so all the passengers have to be anesthetized before even going through. And so that's why all the jaunt attendants in the jaunt airport are walking around with gas masks, basically, like putting people under for their subsequent trips. It's never actually confirmed what happens if you go through the jaunt while awake, but Mark remembers a possibly apocryphal story about a death row inmate who was given the chance to be pardoned if he agreed to go through while conscious. So he agrees to it, and then when he comes out the other side, his hair is like completely white, he's delirious, and all he said was, "It's eternity in there," before he died. Mark did not relay this particular anecdote to his family, however, and to his horror, upon emerging from the jaunt on the other side, he comes to learn that his rebellious son decided to hold his breath and pretend to fall asleep so he could see what it was like. The story ends with the pretty infamous scene where his son comes out convulsing and screaming and like tearing his eyeballs out and repeating over and over again, "It's longer than you think, Dad. It's longer than you think." I think the story is so effective and so scary, but not in King's traditional horror sense. It's on a much deeper, much more existential level. I love how the details of what happens while someone is awake in the jaunt are never fully explored, but it's heavily implied that you're just awake in there for like hundreds of millions of years, maybe even an infinite amount of years, just trapped in an empty void. Like on the outside it's instantaneous, but on the inside it's eternal. Kind of a chilling thought, and the story really lets you stew on it by implying this horror pretty much right away. So the rest of the story is just kind of waiting for this mysterious, horrible fate to happen to one of the protagonists, and then when it does, the dread is just as awful as you'd imagined it all along. Really fantastic story. Probably one of King's best forays into science fiction. Definitely one of his creepiest concepts. Really makes you think, and the harder you think about it, the worse it gets. Coming in at number 4, we have The Raft. I personally find it impressive that The Raft is simultaneously like so gruesome and also just like so ominous and creepy and like eerie. I feel like a lot of the time, if a story is grotesquely bloody and gory, it kind of happens at the expense of the mystery or the creepiness. Like extreme violence and injury does not need mystery to be scary. It is just inherently scary, like on a visceral level. You don't want that stuff happening to you. So in a way, this story is unique uniquely horrific by how it takes this eerie, unknown creature and makes it a ruthless, barbaric, disgusting monster. The concept here, like many great Stephen King short stories, is very simple. On a late October evening, 4 college students named Randy, Deke, Laverne, and Rachel decide to swim to this raft floating in the middle of a lake. Just as they're climbing up, Randy notices like a dark circular shadow just beneath the surface of the water. At first they think it might be like an oil slick or something, but when Rachel reaches out to touch it because it kind of hypnotizes her with these weird, pretty iridescent colors, it attaches to her arm and basically starts to melt right through her skin and flesh. And then she falls into the water screaming and is basically instantly ripped apart and consumed by this weird creature, whatever it is. So super horrifying right off the bat. And then after that, the remaining 3 figure that they're probably too slow to just swim back to shore. But at the same time, they are on a very isolated lake, miles away from any people, and it's also becoming really cold outside. So Deke, he decides like he's going to make a break for it anyway, try to outswim the creature. But before he can do that, the creature swims under the raft and attaches to his foot through the crack between the wooden boards of the raft. What proceeds is probably the most grisly Stephen King passage I've ever read in my life. He just describes in acute, disgusting detail how Deke gets slowly pulled through the crack of the raft. Like his skin and flesh are just peeling off his leg. His thigh is like gushing blood. His pelvis and his bones are like crunching when they reach the crack. His eyeballs are bulging and spewing blood. I'm sorry that I'm even describing this, honestly. It's really, really horrible. The whole time he's just like shrieking in agony. It's honestly insanely fucked up. It's really fucked up. Just completely sickening, terrifying, gruesome. So you got Laverne, she like passes out from shock, and so Randy is basically like holding up her unconscious body because he's afraid that it's gonna, if she like lays down, it's gonna do the same thing to her. And he's also afraid to sit down on the raft for the same reason, or lay down, so he's basically just standing on the raft this whole time. Now at this point, I kind of have to bring up this sort of stupid through line to the story, which is that for some reason it's like very horny and sexual, and like there's this weird undertone kind of present throughout the whole story. It's definitely trying to evoke sort of like a campy, cheesy teen movie from the 60s and 70s, so I get what he's doing. But the reason I bring that up is because the next thing that happens is Laverne and Randy decide to have sex on the raft, which is a completely unfathomable decision given the circumstances, but I guess they do it under the guise of like they're trying to stay warm or something. But it obviously turns out to be a bad move because this weird goo creature does end up killing Laverne in the same horrifying way that it got Deke. And after this, there's these kind of scenes where Randy is sort of getting hypnotized by this creature's strange, colorful lights that reside within the dark goo. And he's sort of accepting the idea that he should like jump in the water and let it eat him. So on one hand, it's an incredibly brutal story that does a great job of sickening you with its like vivid depictions of gore and mutilation, but it also has this wonderfully creepy, enigmatic shadow monster with no real discernible qualities besides its thirst for blood and the unusual like bands of colors swirling in it. So yeah, I just have to give this story its props because I'm not sure I've ever read a Stephen King story that has made me feel so viscerally uncomfortable before, and I think some of it will be seared into my brain forever. And the fun never stops because coming in at number 3, we have Survivor Type. Another Stephen King story that just makes you go like, Jesus Christ, man. Similar to what I said about the Jaunt, Survivor Type I feel like has somewhat of a reputation, and I knew a decent amount about the plot before I actually read it. But that did not take away from any of the intensity of reading it. It's about this surgeon named Richard Pinzetti, and he's in the process of smuggling heroin on a cruise ship when it crashes, and he finds himself stranded alone on a tiny little island with no food source whatsoever. The story is actually structured as Richard's diary entries. So like he recounts his days spent attempting to survive under these harsh conditions on this tiny little island. At one point he manages to kill and eat a raw bird, but other than that, there's nothing to eat. There's no vegetation on the island. There's no fish near the shore. There's just nothing. And then to make matters worse, at one point he like severely breaks his ankle and he basically comes to the conclusion that he's going to have to amputate his own foot. Luckily, he is a professional surgeon, and also luckily, if you can call it that, one of the only supplies he has with him is painkillers in the form of a ton of heroin. The amputation is successful, and then Richard decides, like, hey, I'm gonna eat my own foot. I got it here. I might as well eat my foot. And that is him kind of crossing the Rubicon, so to speak, because then after that he starts to amputate more and more of his body as the food situation remains dire. It is really fascinating how Stephen King is able to paint this man's mental deterioration through his diary. Like, not only is he starving and losing blood from eating himself, but he's also growing delirious from his increased usage of heroin. And the way that Stephen King describes this guy with no limbs, completely stoned, incoherent, and raving, just like dragging his own legless body across the sand, is just such a bleak and horrific image that you almost have to respect it just for the gall alone. At the very end of the story, Richard implies that he's going to start eating his own hands, which is a perfectly dark ending because, for one, all throughout the story, he talks about how important it is to take care of your hands as a surgeon. But two, he'll no longer be able to, write this diary that we're reading. Like, the very fact that the story stops there basically works to verify that this exact scenario has happened. And I thought it was just a wonderfully harsh way for this story to end. It's so grisly that it kind of comes off as campy at some points, but in a way, I think that's totally endearing, and it's just the sort of thing that only Stephen King can really pull off. And yeah, I don't know. I guess it makes sense to me why this story has remained one of his most enduring, iconic short stories to date. Really loved it. And coming in at my number 2 favorite story in Skeleton Crew is Mrs. Todd's Shortcut. So once again, this story works in part due to its pretty simple concept. Shortly before she goes missing, this woman named Mrs. Todd finds these increasingly large shortcuts driving from Castle Rock to Bangor until the shortcuts get so large that they defy logic. It's a pretty weird concept, and I think Stephen King does a great job of playing into that weirdness while keeping the story vague enough to kind of allow the reader to read between the lines and fill in their own blanks a little bit. Similar to other stories here, it has a pretty interesting frame. It's a man named David, who is ostensibly the main character, but he's listening to this story being told to him from a friend who himself is recounting the story like secondhand. So there's a lot of degrees of alienation which kind of keep the story mysterious. The friend who's telling David the story is named Homer, and like he himself is also doing a lot of speculation about Mrs. Todd and her activities, so there's just a lot of unknowns. It kind of gives the story an almost folkloric feeling, like it sounds like a legend in a way. So anyway, Homer is relaying to David about this one particular instance in which Mrs. Todd invited him on one of her shortcut drives that she likes to do. He talks about driving through these like thickly forested roads deep in the middle of nowhere that he'd never seen or like heard of before at all. He talks about how these roads are filled with these strange moving plants and unknown, weird, mysterious wildlife. He describes it as though Mrs. Todd has found a shortcut through some like bizarre other dimension. So every time Mrs. Todd finds a shortcut between Castle Rock and Bangor, it gets a little bit shorter and a little bit shorter. Like the distance between these two cities via driving gets smaller and smaller. Homer's kind of getting suspicious of how short these drives are taking, so he pulls out a map and he measures a distance of 79 miles between the two cities in a straight line. So just as the crow flies, the two cities are 79 miles apart. So one day Homer shows up to Mrs. Todd's house, looks at the odometer on her car, and he realizes that she somehow made the trip in only 66 miles. So 13 miles shorter than the like actual distance between the two cities. The only explanation we get is that Mrs. Todd says she had to bend the map to make it work. I love that Stephen King doesn't explain it. I think that's part of what makes the story so great. We don't know how she's able to find a shortcut shorter than the actual distance between the two cities. We don't know exactly what fantasy dimension she drove through to get there. There's also a whole thing about how she's getting like explicably younger every time she makes the trip. These things just kind of happen at you, and it just leaves you with this feeling of confusion and wonder. At the very end of the story, Homer meets David at his place to like say goodbye and say that he's moving to Vermont. But when he leaves, David catches a glimpse of Mrs. Todd in the driver's seat of her Mercedes before Homer gets in. So it's kind of implied that like he's going to go with her. She's going to take him to whatever weird place that she's been going. And so he just gets into the car and they just drive off into the night. I just think the story is so whimsical and strange and kind of beautiful. I love that it unveils its weirdness so slowly and never completely unveils it. We never know where the two of them end up. We never know what mystical shortcuts they were taking. We never know the nature of what's going on. But you kind of just, hope that they end up in someplace better. And my number one favorite story in Skeleton Crew is The Mist. It's honestly kind of cheap to have The Mist at number one, I feel like, because it's so significantly longer than any other story in this collection. It's kind of like ranking a straight up novel up against a bunch of short stories, which is a little bit unfair, but don't yell at me, all right? He put this in this collection. He put The Mist in with a bunch of other short stories. What do you want me to do? The Mist is number one, best story in Skeleton Crew. If you've ever read Stephen King's first foray into nonfiction, Danse Macabre, which is essentially like an analysis of the genre of horror, he outlines what he saw as the 3 levels of horror. There is gross out horror, there is horror, and there is terror, basically. I thought it'd be kind of fun to look at The Mist through this exact lens because I'm not sure that I've read a Stephen King story that so perfectly and concisely demonstrates all 3 of those things at the same time. So I'll start with the terror because it is more or less the premise of the entire story, which is that this huge storm rolls through town. David Drayton, he's the main character. Him and his son go to a local grocery store to get supplies because of the storm. While they're in the store, this mysterious, opaque mist descends on the entire town, and it effectively traps everybody inside this grocery store. Of these 3 types of horror, King describes terror as the finest and also the hardest one to achieve of the 3 types of horror that he laid out. It's all about suspense and dread and anticipation and fear of the unknown, kind of preys on your imagination. It's the idea that if your brain can't comprehend something, it has to invent something terrifying to fill in the blanks. The famous example he gives is when you come home and notice that everything you own had been taken away and replaced with an exact copy. I think The Mist itself is a great example of this because Stephen King leaves so much of it unexplained. You never learn the nature of the mist, how it got there, what caused it, how much area it covers, how long it will last, what exactly resides in it. It's just this mysterious, omnipresent thing that the characters have to reckon with, and by itself is a terrifying concept. But to make matters worse, King decides to inhabit this ominous mist with a bunch of horrifying creatures. I love the way that he slowly unveils the monsters in the mist through the eyes of David. The first time you get any hint of this, it's when these giant tentacles creep through the back storage area of the store and drag this grocery bagger named Norm off into the mist. And then later that same night, the first night, the entire glass-plated storefront is covered with these disgusting pink fleshy insect creatures with these giant bulbous eyes who are then themselves attacked by these gaunt pterodactyl things. What else? There are also giant spider creatures with poison webs. There's some kind of scorpion-looking guy. An abundance of horrific creatures populate the mist, and these things work hand in hand to cover King's other 2 types of horror in this genre analysis, which are horror, like unnatural things, monsters, and gross out via enormous, disgusting bugs, not to mention the brutal and gory way in which many people of the story are killed. He really comes at you from all fronts here. It's very remarkable just how many discrete events there are crammed into what is otherwise a relatively small story still. There are also a surprising amount of characters crammed into this novella. Obviously, King likes to do ensemble casts, and he's great at it, but it almost felt a little bit over the top with this story because there are so many characters in such a small amount of time. But it kind of works to make this sort of frenzied hysteria. So many characters in this book end up dying that it kind of evokes this sense of disorientation and chaos that's just constantly going the entire time. No one is safe. People who are built up as somewhat integral characters are just unceremoniously annihilated by some awful hidden creature in the mist. Ollie Weeks, for instance, he's one of the employees at the store. He's kind of David's right-hand man throughout the story, and he's killed off in about 2 sentences. David himself is a pretty conventional straight man, King protagonist, maybe a bit more of an asshole than most of them, but he's fine, and he's depicted as a good father to his son Billy, who is with him the whole time. There's also the classic King religious fanatic character, Miss Carmody, who is just as frightening and frustrating as the rest of them that he writes. And also, I want to talk about the ending, specifically the differences between the movie ending and the book ending, because it seems like a pretty divisive issue. There's a lot of discourse about this. Personally, I think they're both good in their own way. I respect the gall of the movie version, just the sheer audacity of making David kill all his loved ones out of a sense of futility, only for rescue to come like seconds later, basically. Super vicious and heart-wrenching in a way that the book ending is not. But that being said, I actually do prefer the ending of the novella to the movie. And in some ways, I would say that its implications are actually even more bleak. Like, yeah, David's situation in the movie is more brutal, but there are also rescue personnel driving into the mist with flamethrowers, which implies that the situation is more or less under control. People are alive. The mist is containable in some way. The ambiguous ending of the novella makes the mist seem so much more eternal. Like, the situation just seems so much more hopeless. No survivors shown. There's no hint that the mist has any end. There's really no resolution in any way, actually. One of the most haunting sequences in the book is right at the end when they're driving down the highway and they pass under this enormous six-legged monster that's so huge they can't even see its stomach through the mist. There's like a tiny shred of hope at the end in that David thinks he might maybe have heard the word Hartford on the AM radio, but that's all they have to motivate them forward. You can kind of decide for yourself if you think David imagined that or not, but either way, you're left with this kind of sinking dread, and then the story ends. I love this novella overall. Super claustrophobic, ominous, mysterious, very concise. I think middle-length fiction like this is maybe Stephen King's strongest form, and The Mist is just another phenomenal example to toss on the pile. And yeah, that's my ranking of the Skeleton Crew short story collection. I don't know how long this video is going to end up being. Probably significantly too long. My mouth is dry from talking so much. But it's a good collection. Probably one of his best. Maybe not one of his best consistency-wise, but definitely one of his best in terms of like the high of the highs, if that makes sense. So yes, thank you for watching. If you watched, maybe I'll do another one of these someday. I don't know. Bye.